We'll talk more about the Sixers, also recap the NBA trade deadline. Get into all of that and more. He is the co-host of the NBA podcast, quality editor for Bleacher Report. Bryan Toporek joins us now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline here on 97.3 ESPN. Bryan, how you doing this Saturday?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, Josh.
So before we get to the Sixers and everything else, full disclosure, because I've talked with Keith Smith when I've had him on a couple times before, we are all in a NBA fantasy league. And I just want to point out that you are the commissioner of the aforementioned fantasy league, and I want to thank you publicly for keeping me around in the league.
For sure, man. Happy to help.
So let's get into the Sixers here, because everybody has a perspective on this team, and I think that as time progresses, the perspective I'm starting to take more and more, Bryan, and I want to hear your perspective on this because you cover the whole league, is that to me it doesn't matter who the coach is anymore. I'm just not sure if a Joel Embiid, Ben Simmons 1-2 punch basketball team can ever win an NBA championship.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the overarching question hanging over this team, right? Like, they need to ultimately figure out whether these two guys are compatible. You can see why they wouldn't be. I mean, Ben likes to push the pace, run in transition. He's most effective in that. He should be surrounded by shooters, ideally. And Joe is willing to take three-point shots, but is not a great three-point shooter by any means. Joe is more of a half-court oriented guy, also should be surrounded by shooters, and Ben is famously reluctant to shoot. So that seems like a minor issue. With that said, I mean, they were 1 4-bounce shot away from the Eastern Conference Finals last year. We don't know what would have happened when they got there. I'm going to go to my grave saying that Toronto was a worse matchup for them than Milwaukee last year. I think they actually had a chance to knock off the Bucks last year had they gotten there. So I don't know necessarily that I would give up on the Ben-Joe combination right now. I just think, especially the frustration with this year's team, is that they haven't built well around those two guys. And now you've kind of cashed in a lot of your chips. When they made the Jimmy trade, and now they traded Jimmy for Josh Richardson, and they made the Tobias trade and re-signed him and signed Al Horford to such a big contract, it's going to be tough to make any major alterations to this group. Like, I don't think Al Horford right now has positive trade value. If they wanted to break this thing up, I think they would have to pay in some form of either giving up Matisse to package with Al to get off of him, giving up draft picks, something like that. So we'll see what happens. I mean, they brought in a couple of guys, Alec Burks, Glenn Robinson, 3 at the trade deadline. I think these guys are actually going to help more than their talent level might suggest. But it really all comes down to how adventurous and creative Brett Brown is willing to be over the next couple months. I think the Ben, Al, Joe trio probably not long for this world, unless in specific matchups like going against Toronto that has Pascal Siakam, Serge Ibaka, Marc Gasol, that it might make more sense there. But going against wing-heavy teams like Boston or Miami, I think they've tried to kind of bully ball and just beat them with size, but I don't know if that's necessarily the right play. I think having these new guys come in gives Brett a little more flexibility in terms of the lineups that he can throw out. Now he can have more shooting on the floor at all times.
So then what change would you make? Is it maybe the starting lineup and maybe taking Horford out of the starting lineup? Would it be, maybe going with a different rotation of guys when guys come in and out of the game now that Burks and Robinson are here? Or is it just, this team wasn't constructed properly and, you might have to just see how it plays out before really determining, what they really can or can't do after the postseason?
Yeah, I mean, I clearly at this point they were willing to keep their starting 5 together. I think they did want to give them at least one shot to see. I mean, they built this team specifically thinking we're going to face the Bucks at some point. We need the size to contain Giannis. Al has had success in that matchup over the years. I mean, Joe on Christmas Day had some of the best one-on-one defense I've seen against Giannis from any player. So the upside is there. I mean, we've seen this team, the first game against Miami, the Christmas Day against the Bucks, even the third quarter last night against the Grizzlies. Like, that's the Sixers at their best. And when they play like that, they are a championship caliber team. It's just you haven't seen very much of that or the consistency that you would hope to. I mean, the road woes in particular have been off discussed this year, so we don't need to go into those. But, right now they're the 5 seed in the East. They're going to be starting the playoffs on the road, so they need to figure that part out. In terms of the lineup, I mean, Brett came out yesterday before the game, and he said everything is on the table, which I think is pretty notable because they still do have 2 months to figure this thing out before the playoffs start. Their schedule after the All-Star break, by and large, is relatively easy. They have a couple tough games here or there, but I think most of them coming against teams below 500. So they have a chance to turn this thing around and kind of get their swagger back before the playoffs start. I do think, I would like to at least experiment with bringing Horford off the bench. This is probably going to sound crazy because this guy is on a 1-year minimum deal, but I kind of think bringing Glenn Robinson into the starting lineup would make some sense. Just because you can do Ben, Josh, Robinson, Toby at the 4, and then Embiid. Robinson's a good defender. He's not going to give you much off the bounce creation, but he's a good shooter. He's shooting 40% from 3 this year. Good on catch and shoots. So I think you kind of want just a lower usage guy who you don't necessarily need. Like the ball is going to go through Ben. It's going to go through Tobias. It's going to go through Joel in the starting lineup. You just need someone to kind of be standing on the corner or standing above the break and hit the open shots that Ben is creating on his driving kicks or that Joel is creating when he gets double teamed. And then off the bench, you can have Alec Burks, who does have a little bit of more off the dribble chops. You've got Korkmaz coming off the 34-point game. He can give you some nice scoring off the bench. You have Matisse for the defense. You have Horford there who can actually help run the second unit a little bit more. He's a great passer for a big man, and the Sixers have not taken advantage of that as much as I would have thought they would this year. So, I do think there are combinations to make this team work as currently constructed. I'm just not convinced the Ben, Joel, Toby, Al, Josh starting 5 is the best way to maximize them going forward.
Bryan Toporek joining us here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Make sure you check out his podcast, the NBA Podcast. You can subscribe to on Spotify, Spreaker, and other platforms as well. Again, it's the NBA Podcast, covers the league as a whole. Bryan, let's talk about that NBA trade deadline. To me, when it comes to the Eastern Conference, the one team that I don't think anybody can overlook at this point is the Miami Heat didn't just make an upgrade. They made an upgrade that just totally sounds like a Eric Spoelstra, Pat Riley Heat team. Iguodala, Jay Crowder. I mean, you're bringing in 2 dudes who I feel like those guys were born to play in Heat jerseys at this point.
Yeah, I mean, both are tough defenders. Iggy, of course, Finals MVP a couple of years ago. He hasn't played in 7 or 8 months, so
that might be a good thing, actually.
Yeah, I mean, he's said 5 straight runs of the finals. Look at what happened. Clay's out, Steph is out, Trey has kind of been lollygagging through most of the year. So, yeah, that rest actually might help him. And I don't think the Heat are going to rely on him for 30 minutes a night. He's probably going to play 15, 20, just be a nice defensive stopper off the bench. But, yeah, I totally agree. I think if any team, Toronto, Boston, Milwaukee also padded the deadline. Milwaukee just got Marvin Williams off of waivers from Charlotte, so that was their big upgrade, but they don't really need one. They're steamrolling the whole league. But yeah, Miami probably cemented itself as the second best team among that group. It's like Toronto, Boston, Indiana, Miami, and then Philly in that 2 through 6 mix. Toronto has been great as well this year at 13 straight wins now, so no one should be overlooking them. But yeah, if that Miami team plays up to its potential, I still don't know if they can beat the Bucks in a 7-game series, but I think they can now definitely beat any of the other teams and make it to the Eastern Conference Finals.
Brian, I'm kind of on the position at this point. Speaking of the Toronto Raptors, I think Nick Nurse should be Coach of the Year because, nobody had any expectations for this team to be as good as they have played, especially with a 19-7 record on the road. Fred VanVleet has played out of his mind. Pascal took another step. I mean, they got guys coming out of nowhere making these great contributions, and I don't think we can overlook the fact that Nick Nurse, just 3 years ago was a nobody, and now he's got an NBA ring, and the next year he has his team right back in the 2 seed.
Yeah, I at the mid-season point, I had Frank Vogel as my unofficial Coach of the Year. But I was thinking last night as I watched them win their 13th straight game, it's probably time to pivot to Nick Nurse. I totally agree. What he's done this year is unbelievable. I mean, not only do you lose Kawhi Leonard, but you also lose Danny Green, who was an integral part of that title team. I think I saw someone tweet yesterday that they have a better record at this point. I think they were like 37-15 last year, and 38-14 this year, or something like that. Like they have kept pace with what they did last year with Kawhi Leonard, with Danny Green, with the team that ultimately won a championship. And it's not like they have been healthy the whole year. Pascal Siakam missed some time earlier in the year. A couple of their guys have. So it's a true, really impressive job from Nick Nurse. But, I mean, Spoelstra is going to be in there in that mix. I think Frank Vogel ultimately will as well, just because, sure, he has LeBron and Anthony Davis, but I don't think anyone expected the Lakers to be this good this quickly.
Speaking of Vogel, he is from our neighborhood down here. He's from Wildwood, which is about maybe 25 minutes here from the studio here on 97.3 ESPN. I think a lot of people had a lot of questions when he took the coaching job because, a lot of times when you're coaching a LeBron team, you're not really coaching LeBron as much as you're getting the rest of the team to buy into the gameplay each week. And I think that, you could argue that the Lakers have actually maybe exceeded some expectations because of Vogel maybe not being this, big time name head coach.
Yeah, I mean, the other concern when Vogel got hired is that Jason Kidd got hired as the assistant head coach. So it was just, the joke was, well, he's on the clock already to get overthrown at some point. He's done well to quiet those concerns, at least so far. I think the big thing is he just got the entire team, including LeBron, to buy in on defense, which we haven't seen LeBron do in the regular season for upward of a half decade now. So, I mean, that's setting the tone for this Lakers team. And their size is overwhelming most times. I mean, they lost to the newly small ball Houston Rockets on Thursday, but most nights, having LeBron, AD, Dwight Howard, JaVale McGee, it's just giving them such an advantage on the glass, rim protecting, points in the paint, and they've taken advantage of it. I think if you're looking at it in terms of a pure talent perspective, the Clippers are a more talented team than the Lakers this year. Like, the Lakers have 2 top 5 guys, but then who's the third best guy on that team? Kyle Kuzma, Danny Green? I don't know. It's not a top 50 player in the NBA. So for them to have the best record in the West, it's really impressive.
Brian, one more before I let you go, and I appreciate your time here on 97.3 ESPN. Again, Bryan Toporek, the co-host of the NBA podcast. Check it out, the NBA podcast. You can follow Brian on Twitter as well at btoporek, BTOPOREK. Brian, is there a team in the East or the West? They're not maybe one of the top 3 teams, but a team that you look at and say, you know what? If that team gets the right matchup, they could just shake up everything in this playoff.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by this Houston experiment. I don't think it's going to work, but it's at least more fun to watch than James Harden dribbling for 20 seconds and then launching a step back 3. So, maybe they can shake things up just by forcing teams to meet them in the middle, basically. They're saying we're not going to play a center. We're playing 6'5" PJ Tucker as our starting center now, and we're just going to basically bank on math. Like, we know you're going to beat us up in the paint. We know we're probably going to lose the rebounding battle every night, but we're just going to say, you know what? 3 is worth more than 2. We're going to jack 53s a night. If we don't go super cold, ultimately the math is going to win. So Of all of the teams after the trade deadline, I think Houston is the one I'm most intrigued to watch moving forward, just to see, because this is just such a bold experiment from Daryl Morey and from Mike D'Antoni, and they're operating like guys who either know they're getting fired at the end of the season or don't care if they're getting fired at the end of the season. So when you're coaching and when you're running a team like you have nothing to lose, you get fun experiments like this.
Bryan, I appreciate you again jumping on the show, and hopefully we'd have you get on in the future.
For sure. Thanks for having me.